Your TA. I would like to welcome you all to the fourth webinar in the course, Water Addressing the Global Crisis. Before we continue, I would like to remind you to only post short questions within the word limit in the chat box. If you have long questions outside of that word limit, it would be very hard for me to keep track of all your questions. Additionally, I would also like to ask you to refrain from having discussions in the chat box. We have a discussion forum for that, and I would really encourage you all to discuss freely there. So thank you. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Marianne Kjellén from United Nations Development Program and Dr. Alejandro Jiménez from Stockholm International Water Institute. Welcome.
Okay, good. So welcome everybody. Great to have you here. Let me first say a few words about why do we have a module on water governance in this course on water. Basically, water is needed for cooking, cleaning, keeping ourselves and our houses clean. Also, it's fundamental for food production, industrial production, and energy production, as well as the foundations for ecosystems and other uses like recreation, navigation, very important. And this really calls for careful balancing of different needs. They're sometimes conflictive, sometimes complementary. But there are different needs, different interests that requires us to have a full understanding of the use to make the best use of this precious liquid. And water governance, it's really the catch-all term for the frameworks that we use, that society uses for determining who gets water, when, and how. And really, for water governance to work well, we emphasize the role of inclusiveness, fairness, and the need to build trust and for people to work together jointly towards shared visions and goals. So in spite of its complexity, good water governance, that's really the linchpin for ensuring that water contributes and enhancing water's role for sustainable development.
Yes, thanks, Marianne. And linked to what you were saying, actually, I wanted to explain a little bit what was the structure of the course that we had for the governance chapter. And first, we went through why water governance is important, as Marianne has now explained. But then we went more into detail into, from one end, the water services. So what we know that the access to water and sanitation is a human right, and that is the fundamental aspect of what we have to look at when we look at water services. It means that we have duty bearers in the form of the governments and right holders, in the form of the people, and trying to see how this relationship can work better and deliver services for everyone. And then there is the other part of water governance that has to do with water resources. So here the biggest challenge is how to balance the competing interest from the economy, from the society, and from the environmental sustainability. And as we know very well, so far, the quick economic output has been the predominant winner of this kind of battle, typically with serious environmental problems, as we have seen. So, of course, water resources and water services are very much connected. And we also, in the course, dedicate a specific segment of looking at the water governance challenge from a different perspective, this water footprint, right? Meaning the water footprint, what is the water used for the production of a certain service or a certain good that then is traded globally. So the example that was given, a t-shirt that is produced in Bangladesh, sold in Paris. So this, of course, means that the governments are choosing which is the goods that they produce outside, what is the water that is involved in that, and there are some trade-offs between the food security, the environmental pollution that you are contributing to create here or there, and of course this talks to all of us to see how we are responsible consumers, as well as, very importantly, to the companies as well, through the water stewardship concept, how they really use and treasure water in a socially and environmental sustainable way. So in few words, these were the key structure of the water governance segment. And now perhaps we will open up for your questions. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so the first question comes from Mona. She wonders, this is regarding to water footprint, and she wonders, how can we locally and globally manage water footprints in industrial sectors to balance water consumption as much as possible?
Well, I think that was exactly part of what I said before. So there is the local and the global dimension. The local dimension has to do with the production of the actual good, where, for example, if we continue with the example of the t-shirt, you can look at what are the production processes, what is the use of water, what is the use of chemicals, what is the wastewater produced, how it can be treated properly, reused if possible. So there is this whole water footprint at the local level. And then, of course, the global part of it is the whole trade issue. The t-shirts are produced here, are sold somewhere else, and then how can we optimize and at least be conscious of what is the water footprint and other footprints that these goods have, and trying to be to balance the economic benefit with the social and environmental sustainability of the business. I don't know if Marianne wants to add something.
I think sort of also, like, especially I think the water footprint, I mean, the analysis is extremely important when we're thinking about also the global flows, or the ones that are not so visible in the place we are. And for example, yeah, another typical example is, for example, if we consume a lot of meat, red meat, we also know that's somewhere else where the consumer will not see. There is a lot of effects on land management and water use, and that's really, so partly it's like, governance involves all of us, and part of that is like, responsible consumers, and the way all the different trade well, not trademarks, but like, these frameworks for understanding what are the effects of our consumption. That's really one really important part of involving us as consumers, as stakeholders. So this is one way of understanding what are the effects of the consumption in terms of water use and pollution in other areas where we don't see it. So where this can really help for the understanding, and also in some cases, as appropriate, the regulation also, where there are things that need to be regulated or even prohibited, even though it occurs somewhere far away from the point of consumption. So I think, yeah, the water footprint really adds a lot to the global dimension and the multi-stakeholder involvement in the fairly sometimes complex governance relations around this resource. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Okay, so next question comes from Ismail. He writes, there are always talk about the importance of the regulatory body to implement the water policy. Can you explain this?
Yes, thank you for that question. And that is one of the aspects that is covered in one of the segments, right? If we talk about the human right to water and sanitation, that means that everyone, everywhere, has to receive the services. And of course, this means that the people that are located in places or that are easy to access, as well as those that are not so easy to access, the rich and the poor, everyone. And of course, from a service delivery point of view, if we would just, in principle, leave the water utility to just try to maximize the efficiency and the benefit, then there is a risk that some of these segments of population would not be served or would be charged an unreasonable tariff. So regulation comes in to try to make this universality of service a reality, as well as, of course, trying to balance the interest of the different stakeholders. We have the policymakers, we have the service providers, we have the users, and each of them might have different priorities. Regulators, when they work well, act as a referee, in a match. There are some rules. We have to establish the rules first, and all the players in the game have to abide to the rules. And it's about taking care that the rules are properly applied, and that applies to everyone, of course. It's not only the service provider, but the users also have some rules to fulfill. For example, you can't go out in the street and damage the water infrastructure, right? As well as the most typical thing, the service providers need to provide water at a tariff that is agreed through a contract with a quality of service that has been properly agreed. And as well as the regulator can look between in the relationship between the government and the water service provider, which can be public or private, but there has to be, or mixed, but there has to be an agreement of what each of one is responsible for, what is the agreements in terms of service delivery, as well as how to report back the information and so on.
Yeah, so I think just to emphasize, the really important function of the regulator is the balancing of different interests, where it's like the public interest in health and universal access, as well as sometimes you can call it the interest in profitability, which might be there for if it's a commercial provider, and there may be conflicts, or there are conflicts in different interests. So, and just to also clarify that, the regulators, they can be independent regulators, or sometimes they are part of the government. Also, it can be sometimes it's the ministry doing the function of regulation, but increasingly so, we have independent regulators, and that's also been in the whole evolution in the past decades, where we have more of also independent providers of services that can be public or in private, which has been also the new thing in the last 3 decades. So then it's become much more important and common with independent regulators, and just also a typical thing, which is like the regulators may be actually licensing the providers to continue their operations, and they may be also approving requested price changes, for example, or on their own initiative, also requiring regulators to adjust their tariffs or price levels. And I think there is also critique, which sometimes has been there, about the regulations that are implemented. Very often you might have a water policy in the country that says we should have universal access, and it could be uniform tariffs, or equality should be promoted. Then sometimes we have the regulatory, which can be more technical, is imported from a country where they don't really have the same issues, and issues like really those pro-poor, equity-focused policy objectives are commonly not really reflected in the regulatory, in the rules and the monitoring of the regulators. So that's like a critique when you have in many low-income cities, for example, that are importing regulatory frameworks and practices from wealthier countries that have different issues. So again, I think that comes for all the water governance. It's very, very context dependent in order to be able to really foster the objectives that it's there to serve. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. So moving on to the next question. This is actually 2 questions from, I've combined questions from Nadia and David. So Nadia wonders, are there any examples of successful bottom-up water governance versus top-down? And David wondered, in a bottom-up approach in water resources management, how can we ensure functionality and sustainability of the governance structures, especially at the bottom? So I think that was clear.
Well, these are quite open questions, I would say. Just in terms of bottom-up and top-down, I think it's increasingly recognition that there is a need to understand what's happening in the ground to be able to devise the right water policies, because water is managed very locally. So the decision takes place at many different levels, in the daily use of water, in the small agriculture, in the small industries, as well as in the big facilities. So that means that this decision making and this governance needs to build on what are the current arrangements and what is the current practices and decision making aspects. So there's an increased recognition that only top-down vertical dictation of what needs to be done is rarely being implemented properly. I think the art here is how to make the good mix between what is happening, what is the current practice, what could be improvements to it, and then try to find the right way to put in place decision-making processes and governance mechanisms. So that speaks to also to that other question, right, about how to ensure the governance sustainability of the governance structures at the bottom. I would say that what can happen is if the water policies and so on are not talking to the actual practice, the people or the stakeholders would just operate outside the governance framework. So that is why, as much as they can. So that is why this dialogue between what is happening and what can be done for improvement is really critical. I don't know, Marianne.
Yeah, so I can emphasize, I think that the importance of somehow the combination of, or top down and bottom up. I mean, I think that's the key issue here, that, I mean, if you have a truly bottom up initiative, would be something which is sort of, as Alejandro said, they typically come up when the formal system, or you can call it top down, is not really functioning. And I mean, a typical place now, for example, like I mentioned, like my own research from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, there you have a formal water system, which is only catering actually for a small proportion of the population. So you have, of course, everybody needs water, so there's lots of businesses and own initiatives, and we often call them self-supply. So based on this you would say is truly bottom up. People develop their own sources if nobody else does it for them. The problem with some of these truly bottom up that are not sanctioned or supported by the formal governance system or the laws of the country, they tend to become expensive, but they're not really providing a very good service. And it's usually there. That's how we get these contradictory issues where, like, the poorest people actually paying much more per same volume of water than maybe the wealthier system, or wealthier people in the same city. And that's typically because they are, I mean, the poor are more dependent on self-supplied people that drilling boreholes and selling to their neighbors, or somebody who has a connection and also sells to their neighbors, or water vendors that are in those, like, that serve the, like, you know, not the poorest of the poor, but still people that are not in the elite that have their own network. So that's so I think what we really want is to have some kind of overall system, formal system, that really caters for everybody in a way that there is no need to develop independent systems. Hopefully there is a good provision and that can be done by, like, actually incorporating some of these. When there are systems, it's very good to build on them. And that's where I think the ideal thing, you can actually, an existing, I mean, there are wells or there are systems in a locality, and that's like when let's say, let's roll out service provision here, that you don't just go and make a new system, but actually build on what is there. And that is important with the physical structures, and possibly even more important when it comes to the governance structures. Like there are council of elders or whoever, like, determines things like how are things done in this village, and that the voices and the influence of these people are really taken into account. I think that's great. So if, like, the question also, like, a really successful example, I think, well, for example, also we've had a project in Panama, and this is like it was the case, like, no, we are building a new system here and we have resources for that, but how are you going to ensure that it really responds to the local needs? Then there was, like, this consultant who was constructing the system, every step had to be agreed and authorized by the local indigenous sort of governance committee of the village, the local, the cacique or the chieftain. So there was, like, this thing that, I mean, to go with the pace, timing is extremely important also in these things, that there is sufficient time to discuss the things and to make sure that whatever is supported from outside or like officially condoned, it's actually in line with the local priorities and the people on the ground that are the experts on the local environment, the local needs, and the existing structures. And yeah, there are more examples of this, but I think we should go to the next question, maybe.
Mhm.
Thank you both for that. Yes, we should move on to the next question. There are many questions and we only have 1 hour. So moving on. Olfa asks, the water footprint takes into consideration the life cycle of the product, how much water is used to produce it, but does it take into consideration how much water is polluted by effluents?
Yes, in an indirect way, yes. It's what it's called the gray water footprint, which includes the volume of fresh water required for the assimilation of pollutants. So to bring the water to a level of contamination that is acceptable. So of course, if what you contaminate a lot, then the volume of water that you need to add to bring it to a reasonable level is very high, right? So that is how the water footprint adds liters of water to the footprint of a particular product. So yes.
Yeah, that was the short answer.
Yeah, it was a very concise question. Yeah. So
very good. Thank you, Alejandro. Okay, moving on. Ludmila, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. She wonders, what are your top recommendations of wise fighting with the corruption in developing countries in water management sector? Thank you in advance.
Oh my God.
Yes. Okay.
How long do we have now?
Yeah. Okay. So this is, I think it's, yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, it's a very good question, and corruption is a very, really very important issue, and I think it's a sinister issue. And just in terms when it comes to, I think often the worst thing with corruption is not just that it takes away resources from development, but it skews the agendas in a way, like, you know, there are hidden agendas that make people act in ways that you don't know. So why did this thing happen? And how come this was so poorly done? I think that's, to me, that's the most pernicious and devastating effect of corruption, is that like it takes us away from our official goals and what we are all trying to work for. And then like, you don't know who, but somebody is there having a different agenda. And that's so, that hurts whatever everybody trying to work for the good of society is trying to do. But there are, I mean, so there are, but when we try to work with this, I mean, of course, first of all, I mean, corruption, I mean, that's a criminal activity, and there's police and those things, and there are laws against it. And that is very well, I mean, or it's mostly left to them. So what we are trying to work with, a lot of it is really to make, how can we in the water sector make our systems a bit more robust to withstand the risks of, or to reduce the risk of corruption. So basically, I think Alejandro can tell you more. We have a whole like water integrity program that we work with, and that's basically to build systems that lower the risk for corruption rather than to sort of chase the corrupt. So do you want to just go in a little bit and say what are the techniques for working with this?
Yes, I mean, as Marianne was saying, it's about putting in place the measures that would make corruption more difficult, and also working with of course, with the ethics of public service delivery and so on, to not want to be corrupt. So it has two parts in what we call the water integrity side. And when it comes to the mechanisms, we work with transparency, accountability, and participation as key aspects of how to turn the system more resistant to corruption, or more difficult for corruption to appear. Accountability meaning, of course, the obligation to explain what decisions are being taken and why, from the duty bearers to the right holders, saying, okay, we are planning to do this, or this is the decision because of this and that justification. So and being able, of course, to answer to questions about that, and of course being having the possibility to be rewarded or also face penalties in case of misabuse of your position, right? So that is accountability. And then transparency, which has to do with the whole access to information and the opportunity, of course, in a way that it can be understandable and that it's not costly and that it's not difficult to get, etc. So like good access to information so that the stakeholders can be informed of what's going on at any time and why. And then participation, which gives the opportunity to different stakeholders to take part in the processes of decision making. This can be done at different stages. For example, in case of water management, some water utilities have in their board the possibility to have citizens representatives that would also put forward what are their requests and what are their problems, etc., etc. When it comes to accountability, there are also in water service provision public hearings where users can come in and other stakeholders and present, I mean, what they think should be done, etc., etc. So these aspects help to put in place mechanisms that make corruption more difficult. And of course, there is this other part that has to do with willing not to engage in corruption, working with the public sector efforts are with the, I mean, we are using, I mean, we are, if we are in the water sector, we are dealing with a finite resource. If we are dealing with water services with a human right, so we have a high responsibility. And of course, you also have to talk to the individual responsibility of every one of us to be able to not to engage on corrupt practices.
Yeah, just to add also, I think basically, I mean, corruption is always hidden in a way. Everybody knows it's sort of wrong, but there is a really important aspect of capacity building and training, because sometimes also there is also a little bit, there are fuzzy edges also. And as long people that are well trained, good at their jobs, have high capacity, that's one of the really ways to avoid corruption. It's like the competent people are much less prone to, at least to have like prone to having corruption happen because they don't understand what's happening. So it's so general enhancing capacity of the people for professional and sort of impartial ways of implementing their jobs is really important. And also I want to emphasize also what Alejandro was mentioning on participation, where we have like the different interests represented, maybe in the governing boards, but also the importance of participation of people from different constituencies in their own right. Because corruption can really thrive in environments where there are very like-minded people that don't criticize one another and really have the same interests. They can be kind of clubs based on position, gender, ethnic, whatever. So in where we can break up these kind of close-knit groups, which can sometimes breed more, at least definitely friendship corruption, but also other types of corruption. So there, I think participation is important, not only because of the interest represented by the different people, but also to break up some of these hidden groups. But I think also finally at the broader sense, we have to build trust in society. People generally know what is honest, and as long as people have capacity, and also a detail which is very important, people have to have a salary for their work. If you have a hospital and you don't give salaries to the doctors, you cannot expect them not to ask for a fee from their patients, even if it's not. I mean, it goes with public servants and in any profession. There are countries and there are situations where people are supposed to have carry out a professional job, but they're not being paid for it. That is setting people up for not being able to really do their jobs properly. So I mean, that's the detail which I think everybody knows, but it's not always implemented. That's one thing. But then you have to also at the broader level, you have to be able to trust that others are also doing the right thing. So that's sort of like a mindset. If people believe, oh, everybody's corrupt, so why should I be honest? I'm just being stupid. So no, it's really important to highlight, and that's also when we work with integrity, we say we have to celebrate every victory. It's important not just to feed ourselves with the belief that you can actually fight this big monster or somehow reduce it. Like, every little step that we can celebrate people being honest and doing the right thing and for sustainable development, that also builds trust in society that others can do the same, and it actually helps everyone, and generally people will feel good about it. So this overarching trust building in society, I think that's probably the biggest thing. It's not one thing you can do like that, but that's one of the major factors that people trust one another.
All right, thank you guys. Should we move on to the next question maybe?
But let me just finish with a couple of words we didn't mention, but it's about what we are meaning all the time. It's about collective action. And collective action is very important for fighting corruption, because it has to come from different parts of society, and all trying to work together to create this atmosphere that corruption is no longer acceptable, is no longer valid, and is no longer the rule. Over to you.
Thank you, guys. Well, actually, in connection to this, we have some comments. Maria and Fanny, which are like Fanny commented on Maria's question. Maria is wondering, how can we increase the participation of indigenous peoples in water governance? And then Fanny was also asking, why is local participation so low when 4 out of 5 countries have defined public participation procedures?
Okay. Good. Well, that is coming from the last question. That is an interesting question, because we actually analyzed participation according to the GLASS data, the Global Assessment on Water and Sanitation by WHO, and indeed there is a high presence of participation policies, but a low practice, right? And then we have to question, why is this happening? And of course, well, the fact that you have a law or a policy doesn't make it automatically implemented, right? So there can be issues around resources to implement the participation policy. There can be issues about the capacities of those having to implement the policies. On the other end, there can be lack of trust in the participation process, right? So I'm a citizen and I don't think it's going to yield anywhere. Why should I come? Why should I invest my time on this? And of course, the whole aspect to it free and safe. It might be that in some countries you have participation policies, but in some occasions it might not be that safe for the people to participate and voice what are their concerns, right? So just to give a few points on how, I mean, the existence of the participatory policies doesn't translate necessarily on good public participation.
I think this links a little bit also to what was discussed in the lectures, also the policy implementation gap. We do have, like, yes, some like, for example, participation that is expressed in the policies, and then when it comes to actually doing it or financing it, there are challenges, and I think that's, yeah, and I think, yeah, as Alejandro, there is just, I mean, it's hard work to do everything we say. I think it's also like a general thing, but there can be, I mean, participation does take time. I mean, there are different ways of participating, and there are different levels of influence and these things, and you can structure it different ways. But one way is really information sharing and having discussion and really discussing through what are we going to do in this area, like it, and this kind of consultation participation is a time-consuming process, and there are, I mean, first of all, as we discussed on the previous question on corruption, I mean, if there are hidden agendas and you want something else, then of course participation and transparency is the last thing you want. So that's one thing. There can be some resistance to this, but then I think probably more often there is also this other rush that we have. We speak a lot about accelerating the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to accelerate development, and there is a lot of pressure actually on governments, also on external support agencies and donors. Like, you know, we have to act fast because development is urgent. So in that sense, it's right, but then it's a little bit, we are sometimes maybe tying ourselves down and not adhering to some of these processes need to take time and have to follow other rhythms. And that's especially one thing. Maybe you can speak a little bit about that when we like these issues about working with indigenous people, which is also a question where time is a really important factor. But I just maybe, yeah, there especially we have also this is a free, prior, and informed consent, which is a like important matter there. But let me just end with a little pun when it comes to why on participation. Like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So I think the rush is the enemy of participation, but it's definitely the one which should take us both to 2030 implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and quality in the things that we do.
Let me add a little bit to the indigenous part of the question, right? Participation of indigenous peoples. And actually, we did conduct some research a few years back, and we produced a document on recommendations for an intercultural approach in water and sanitation, which we can find in the Water Governance Facility website. But coming to what the indigenous peoples that we consulted and discussed with were telling us, there were a number of fundamental principles here. First, and the most overarching one, is that the real dialogue. And the real dialogue includes the respect and the trust. So the respect to what are the different cultures, the different world, viewpoints, and how you perceive water, how you use water, and trust across the different actors. Then it has to do with flexibility and inclusion, meaning flexibility to the capacity to change what was the preconceived solution when you enter into a participatory process. And it might be that in this case, indigenous people have a completely different view of how water service should be brought into the community. So this flexibility is really needed if you want to engage with them. And then supportive relationships. So not as it was very often said by the indigenous populations we talked with, it was not they just come, do a meeting and go, and then build something and go. So these supportive relationships in terms of establishing the dialogue, having a permanent dialogue, and also, of course, after the systems, the services are in place, to see how this is going and if there are things to change or adapt. So this document also has many other recommendations in the different stages of how to look at a project and how to engage with indigenous peoples. Marianne mentioned one critical one, the free, prior, and informed consent. But in interest of time, we just leave it here for this question.
Thanks, you guys. Very interesting questions from all our viewers. Okay, so moving on. Dorian is wondering, is economic growth really necessary to reach SDG 6 water, like stated in the executive summary of SDG's water report, and to be stimulated to act with more urgency to implement policies?
Yeah. So, yeah, let me just the simple answer is, of course, yes. I think economic growth is needed, but at the same time, let's make it more complicated. I think there has been, like, if you have sort of unmanaged growth, or I mean, economic growth without any good qualities can also be very exploitative and not build. I mean, so it can generate profit without generating development. So there are, of course, issues. We're not looking into any kind of economic growth. I think it's really the quality that determines how important or how much it contributes. But I think so generally overarching, I think the foundation of human well-being in society is to have a decent economic growth. And there, of course, speaking about human well-being, it means that it's not only a few rich guys in a country, but actually that it's something where people have livelihoods that enable them to sustain a good life and build the future, put their kids in school, in these things. So I think these things are, we speak also like economic development, which has puts the positive connotation. That is often like, economic growth. If you have very few means, I mean, would generally hope to benefit from some growth, which can create job opportunities or livelihoods. On the other hand, there's a lot of this economic growth without regulation or any balancing of different interests, and especially, for example, the interest of the environment, which is what all our futures depend upon. If that interest, nobody's spoken up for the environment, that of course has, you can buy, economic growth means you can produce a lot of things and pollute a lot of things, and that destroys the long-term viability of that whole system and destroys many qualities. So, of course, any economic growth is not always good, but I think it's a fundamental. We do require some economic development and to sustain a decent life, and it should always be need these regulatory functions in our whole governance of society that balances the interest, not to allow, for example, rampant pollution, and also to include some form of redistribution or equitable dimension of the economic growth.
All right. So Carla wonders, most of the impact on conservation of coastal and marine ecosystems comes from river pollution. Can you develop on the source to sea governance scheme? And is this only done at the national level?
Okay, I'll start and you can chip in, Marianne. Well, the source to sea approach talks about integration, right? When, as you rightly say in your question, so the river pollution flows into the coastal and then into the sea, right, and into the marine ecosystems. But the water is also a carrier. It's a carrier of what happens in the land, of what we consume. Now very much in the global agenda, the problem of plastics, right? So we have to look at all these interconnections, not to isolate one of these problems and not thinking on how it is going to go down to the sea in this case. So it's, of course, what has to do with water upstream, downstream, but also in a way across sectors. We have land-based management, we have production issues, consumption issues, etc., industrial pollution. So we have to consider what is really affecting the basin and then the source to sea system to avoid the negative impact into the coastal and marine ecosystems. Typically, we had like very focused approaches, the coastal management, even the IWRM, integrated water resources management, the land-based management, but all these things need to be better integrated because the experience is showing us that we are not avoiding contamination, pollution at the rate that should be, certainly. And on the part of the national level, certainly not. And very important examples of the source to sea frameworks have been done at the transboundary level. So one that comes to my mind is all the whole work in the Danube, in the river in Europe, where along a number of years there has been this integration of what is coming to the river and how we can improve management and reduce pollution.
So again, I think the basic thing that we are struggling with all the time is the integration. While of course we all need to work on our thing and be experts at what we do, at the same time we must look at the bigger context and understand what's happening outside our own little arena, and that's sort of the whole point of integrated water resources management, IWRM, and the source to sea framework. So that things are going, I mean, things are happening beyond, if I'm an agency or a ministry or something beyond my area. So that whole level of understanding the bigger picture. And it's so critical because if we understand that and also take the consequences of making sure that we sort of work, even if we are in different organizations, we are working towards the same goal. And that's why we need to understand what's happening sort of beyond the fence if you're a factory or whatever. But then in this integrated water resources management, what is often emphasized in that is like, you know, the integration between different sectors, and understand that the real water managers are sort of outside of the people that might be water professionals. I mean, the decisions about water use are taken by maybe factory industrial leaders, agricultural people, or they're sort of outside the reach of kind of anybody who would ever read a water policy. But there's someone we have to make sure we understand these processes and bring the effects of these different decisions into our bigger framework. And there the source to sea emphasizes the material flows that also, because just like we and sometimes may not understand what's happening in other sectors, we look at a river possibly and just see the water, but this water is a carrier of, I mean, there's the whole system with the animals, and all the material fluxes that are in that. And I think that's really what the source to sea want to emphasize, that is actually more than water. And as you say, also like this is really critical for like coastal pollution and things. And they say like, you know, at least 98% of all the pollution, it's at sea. I mean, it comes from land, just like Alejandro was saying. It's most of our activities are on land, and that's where we have to think about our waste management systems and wastewater treatment and how we manage production processes and consumption processes generally.
Okay, thank you. So next question, Eek wonders, is there a fixed water management system that can be applied worldwide, or do they vary according to the geographical area? For example, water management in wetlands or drylands?
Well, I think as we were saying before, there is a very important need to understand what is the current water management practice and build on the customary decision making to understand how water is allocated currently. So, of course, there are lessons to be learned from practices in other countries, but it is quite dangerous to come with a blueprint approach and say, okay, this is how water management happened in this wetland and it worked well, let's put it in your place, without understanding what is the current practice and how can this fit to the ways in and how people are sharing water already. So yes, lessons learned and learning from experiences is good, but just fixed water management system, as is in the question, wouldn't be a good recommendation. I think you have to understand how is the local and national context.
Yeah, so just to emphasize, I think it's important to, and I think just referring back, for example, when we were actually doing the research on how to involve indigenous peoples in a better way in the water management, that in the end we didn't come up with a checklist on things to do, but rather came in with it's a state of mind and the dialogue and the exploration. So a little bit it's the governance system, which is actually the laws, the relations, and the way that people collaborate, in a sense, it has to be homegrown in a way. So there and there is actually a danger. I think. I mean, for example, there are a lot of approaches, and we have many like ecosystem-based approach. We have the community-led sanitation approach, and there are many ways. And very often there are lots of very good elements in many different approaches. But once that they are rolled out, there is a tendency to dilute them. And there we have, like, I mentioned also before that sometimes the regulatory framework for a water system might be imported from another country, and it misses some of the important elements of that locality. So I think they're like, by having, it's, as Alejandro said, we do learn from others, and like, countries' legal systems, they're not invented every place. You look at other countries, what did they do? But if you forget your homework about really saying, how does this make sense in this setting, you will probably find yourself with a framework that is not really fulfilling the needs you have, and it's not really managing the resource in the way that you desire. So again, learn from others, but make sure to have homegrown solutions. And also, I'm afraid, in the space that you have to give the time sometimes to work with, to make sure to understand local structures and build upon them in order to get it sort of right for the long term. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Moving on to the next question from Dursun. What do you think about adaptive water management approach? You touched upon it briefly, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays it's very important to be prepared for uncertainties, right? So in the past, also we were more certain about that the data that we were having on the climate, the hydrological patterns, and so on was something that we could use to predict the future, not anymore. So then there is a need to also adopt frameworks that help us to adapt along the way. Because we are more prone to risk in terms of having taken the wrong assumptions, and this also involved more of social learning and more of integration and participation to assess how the situation is going and then move forward.
So I think, yeah, the adaptive management approach, it's evolved as a way to work in a more intelligent way with risks, so that we don't work with like information or facts. I mean, we have different risks that have to be weighed, and a lot of this also it comes from an increasing realization. If you go back to the previous century, there was an idea that, like, we can engineer a society, we can kind of control nature, and that's something which has been, I mean, for a long time it was just criticized, and finding that we are, let's say, wasting resources, and also not always managing to conquer nature in the way that was believed maybe 50 or 70 years ago. So that whole idea of more adaptive management, generally to go with the environment, we call them nature-based solutions, but this way of actually not being so rigid about the objectives of an engineered system, but really work more with nature. And I think, and that is really also the tradition, also where the adaptive management comes. It's actually coming from realizing the need to not only to understand ecological processes, but also to really weave them into the way that you manage the economy in a way. So that added, but otherwise, of course, it's the flexibility that's needed. And now this has been, I mean, now there's no question about it, because now with the climate change, the risks and variability in the weather has changed so much. So you really need that adaptive approach.
Okay, so moving on, Anna she's wondering, could you please talk about the privatization of water companies, mainly in Brazil, where, on the contrary of many EU countries, in Brazil they are planning to privatize the state companies. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, indeed, and happy that you bring this up, because I think Anna also posed a question at some point before. So good that we do some comments before closing on this. Well, there has been different movements here, no? Like 20, 30 years ago, there was a big push for privatization of water companies. It worked only partially, and depending, I mean, the conclusions there were that again, there is not like public or private per se is not giving the solution. It might work in some places, in some places not. Either of those, right? In the European countries, there has been some re-municipalization of services, also because the government, the municipalities thought they could deliver the service at similar quality and perhaps most cost effective. This is, of course, not always true and not always the case in all countries. Other experiences of running public or regaining public control have not been that successful. So in essence, it's not like public or private that will dictate if it works or it doesn't work, but how does it fit in the context? And for private sector, what has been learned as well is that you need very strong regulation attached to it to make it work. So that is something in the case of Brazil to assess how strong the regulation is, as well as how if there is a real need to privatize because the current water utilities, public ones, are not working well. Because if they are working well, then it's also true, and it has been shown by the experience, that the shift from public to private or private to public is not it's costly and takes time to adapt. So there's also a basic question on how good or how bad are these water utilities performing to justify changing the model.
Maybe just add a little bit of the historical perspective. I think, I mean, there has been different times in history when public or private solutions have been favored by different ideologies. But we've had throughout the 1900s, there's been this kind of wave of municipalization that we had, like very state-centric development of water system. And then from the 1970s, when there was like, economic downturn, and governments were increasingly finding themselves having less resources. At the same time, we were increasing the demands on our water systems and putting additional environmental regulatory requirements. So there was a tough with most, and also looking in Europe, for example, there was a need to revamp the water systems that often were like 100 years old, at the same time to make them perform better environmentally. And so with the poor government, we're like, okay, so let's see, the private sector has so much money. So I think a lot of the times, I mean, the privatization drive from a few decades ago was driven as in the quest to get more investment to the sector, very much needed. And then, of course, there has been quite a bit of disillusionment because the private sector were not investing the way it was anticipated. So that's kind of then a disappointment. And of course, there is an ideological aspect of this. This is like privatization has been like the liberal or the neoliberal campaign has been driving privatization. And there is like a political dimension with lots of protests also against these things. Interestingly, however, when it comes to actually implementing privatizations, there is very little difference between if there's a right-wing or left-wing government, but it seems to be broader economic development that are driving these things than the local ideology, even though it definitely does affect in certain countries, and possibly now also with Brazil. I think there's, it's probably a political agenda, but also in Brazil you have the Sabesp. I mean, one of the in Sao Paulo, it's one of the biggest private operators that is also actually on the international or New York Stock Exchange, which is actually in a sense presumably getting capital into its business from private investment. So I cannot speak for the performance, but in a little bit possibly getting that little finance into being invested also not only from government funding, but otherwise I think the general finding from the previous privatization, now a little bit remunicipalization wave, is that financing has not much been coming in, even if you open up for private investors. Private companies have come in a lot as operators, and that's an area where there is a lot of international competence and service providers that sometimes lease or operate on management contract systems that are often owned by the governments. That's sort of the French model, which was just remunicipalized, but still there is a model for how you can work this through contracts. And then like it was touched upon before, and Alejandro mentioned, what has come out of this is the need for regulation. In many countries, we've had public companies that have been operating really with a very, very low quality of operations. And that was also tested. And in many countries, the places where there was no resistance to privatization was like maybe where the public sector management was very poor. But so you realize that, you need some control and balancing of interests, presenting the consumer interests and checking the efficiency of the service. That's something where regulation has come in, and that's probably an inheritance we have from the privatization wave, that we now have generally independent regulators, and I trust they are here to stay regardless of whether the operations are public or private.
Alejandro, any final words on that?
I mean, if I would have some final words, would be to answer the question on the criteria of water as a human right.
Okay, well, all right. Well, I was just getting to that. So we have one final question from Ismail wondering what criteria should we be looking at when we need to reflect on water as a human right? So yeah, final question.
Yeah, well, this is part of what's covered in one of the segments, but the human rights sets a very clear framework of what we should aspire to, and there are normative criteria which speak about the availability, the quality, the acceptability, the accessibility, and the affordability of the service. And there is definition to each of it, like the availability of the water or the toilet has to be there. The quality, of course, the quality of the water, of the quality of the facility, the acceptability by the user, so it has to be culturally acceptable. Affordability when it comes to the price, the cost of accessing the service, and accessibility, of course, that has to be accessible for all members of the family, children, elder, or other disabled, physically disabled people, and so on. And there are core human rights principles that are also criteria, and that speaks to how you deliver the services. And these are the non-discrimination, so the universality, access to information, participation, accountability, and sustainability. And I leave it there, but more, of course, to be found in any manual or publication about human right to water, which is accessible through the website, are in one of the lectures, actually.
Maybe just to add, I think one really important, I mean, as you heard in the lectures also, like the human right to water and sanitation has been discussed, and then increasingly, and then finally, like reaffirmed in 2010 for the right to water and sanitation. I think that the really critical or really important thing that this says is also because it puts being with water for domestic use, we're talking about now, as a human right, puts the responsibility on governments. So basically the member countries of the United Nations have decided that, yes, this is not just something that the individual can deal with or not, but actually governments have a fundamental responsibility for assuring the universal access to water and sanitation. So actually all countries have agreed to do this and recognize this important responsibility. That was very good to get that reaffirmed by the General Assembly.
Indeed. And I think with this, there are great final words on we have all our obligation to work towards the human right to water and sanitation. So thanks for being there, and thanks for your interest in the governance. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we have to sign off because it's been 1 hour already. I want to thank you all students who tuned in, and thank Dr. Marianne Kjellén and Dr. Alejandro Jiménez for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to remind you that next Tuesday, February 19th, we have another webinar with Dr. Alejandro Jiménez, and this webinar is on sanitation services and delivery. It is at 1 p.m. UTC, so 1 hour earlier than the webinar today. And please, if you have any questions and we don't bring them up in the webinar, you can always come back for the next webinar and ask your questions. We can't ensure that everybody will have their answers to their questions because there are so many people. So anyway, I just want to thank Marianne and Alejandro again for taking the time, and take care everyone, and have a lovely day, afternoon or night, depending on where you are in the world.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.